Andy's mother couldn't sleep after the encounter with Sandra. She tossed and turned, her mind replaying the conversation over and over. Her anger burned deep, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw Sandra standing there, claiming to be the daughter of Papa Tunde and Mama Joy, the very same child who had abandoned them. "She is evil," she muttered under her breath, her voice filled with disdain. "How can a woman who left her own parents behind for a life of luxury ever be trusted? I will never allow her to marry my son." Andy's mother, Mary, woke up early that morning, her mind set. She prepared herself meticulously, choosing her best outfit, determined to make the trip to the city to see Andy. She couldn't bear the thought of her son making what she believed was the biggest mistake of his life. She had spent the entire night thinking about Sandra and the danger she felt Sandra posed to her family. "I don't want to regret this later," Mary said firmly as she adjusted her headscarf in the mirror. Andy's father, who had been quietly observing her, frowned. "Mary, are you sure about this? You alone cannot travel to the city," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "The last time we visited, you nearly got lost, and that was with me there. I had to find you before things got worse. You need to take your time." Mary turned to him, her expression sharp. "This isn't something I can wait on, James. I need to talk to Andy now. If I don't, he might make a decision that will destroy his future." James sighed, rubbing his temple. "We can't act in haste, Mary. Let me arrange for us to visit next week. That way, we can handle this together, calmly." But Mary shook her head, her determination unshaken. "This is not about haste. This is about protecting my son. Next week might be too late." James, though unhappy with her stance, decided not to push further. He knew his wife well enough to understand that when her mind was made up, there was little he could do to stop her. "At least let me make some calls to ensure someone is there to meet you at the station," he said finally, relenting. "Fine," Mary replied curtly, grabbing her bag. "But I am going today." As she stepped out of the house, her heart was filled with both anger and a sense of urgency. She didn't know what she would say to Andy, but she was sure of one thing. She would do everything in her power to stop Sandra from becoming a part of their family. Sandra had barely settled into her new job when the weight of her situation started to take its toll. Morning sickness had made even the simplest tasks a struggle, but she was determined to keep going. She couldn't afford to lose another job, not now when she had a baby on the way and so much to prove to herself. One morning, as she sat at her desk, a colleague walked over briskly. "Sandra, the manager wants to see you in his office," she said, her tone neutral. The words hit Sandra like a bolt of lightning. Her hands froze over her keyboard, and her stomach churned, not from morning sickness this time, but from pure fear. She couldn't move for several minutes, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. What have I done? Did I make a mistake? Am I going to be sacked again? Sandra's thoughts spiraled as she imagined herself jobless again, unable to support herself or her unborn child. "No, not now," she whispered to herself, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach. "Please, not now." Her colleague returned, a bit more impatient this time. "Sandra, the manager is waiting for you. You need to go." Sandra took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but her body betrayed her. Her hands were trembling, and her legs felt weak. She whispered a quick prayer under her breath, asking for strength, and slowly stood up. With each step toward the manager's office, her heart pounded harder. She thought she might lose her pregnancy from the sheer stress of it all. "This can't be happening again. I can't take another failure," she thought, trying to calm her racing mind. When she finally reached the office door, she paused for a moment, her hand hovering over the handle. "Whatever happens, I need to face it," she told herself. Summoning every ounce of courage, Sandra pushed the door open and stepped inside. The manager, seated at his desk, looked up from his papers, his expression unreadable. "Have a seat, Sandra," he said, gesturing to the chair in front of him. Her knees nearly gave out as she sat down, clutching her hands tightly to hide their trembling. The silence in the room was suffocating, and she could feel her heart pounding in her ears. "Is this it?" she wondered. "Am I about to lose it all again?" The manager leaned forward, clasping his hands together as he studied her face. "Sandra," he began, "I've been reviewing your work over the past few weeks." Sandra held her breath, her fingers digging into the fabric of her dress as she braced herself for the worst. The door cracked open, and Sandra's heart sank as she saw Andy standing there. He had come to Sandra's office that day for a business meeting with her manager, who happened to be his university friend. As they wrapped up a discussion on their project, Andy excused himself to use the washroom. On his way back, something caught his attention, a familiar figure sitting at one of the desks in the manager's office. It was Sandra. Both froze when their eyes met, clearly shocked to see each other. Sandra's face turned pale, her hands clutching the edge of her desk. Andy stood at the door, his expression a mix of anger and sadness, his emotions bubbling to the surface. The manager, noticing the tension, looked at both of them with curiosity. "Wait," he said, looking between Andy and Sandra. "Do you two know each other?" Sandra nodded hesitantly. "Yes, sir." Andy didn't speak right away, his jaw clenched as he tried to steady himself. The manager, sensing there was more to this than a simple acquaintance, quickly excused himself. "I'll give you two a moment," he said, leaving the office and closing the door behind him. Andy turned back to Sandra, his voice low but sharp. "Sandra, what is wrong with you?" he asked, taking a step closer. "Why have you been avoiding me? Why couldn't you just face me for once?" Sandra opened her mouth to speak, but Andy continued, his voice rising slightly. "Can't you, for once, be selfless? Do you know how many times I called you? How many times I tried to reach out? So we would have never met again if I hadn't come here, right?" Sandra's eyes filled with tears. She couldn't bear the disappointment in his voice, the pain in his eyes. She looked down, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "Andy, I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. A lot has happened. Too much. And I didn't know how to face you. I didn't know how to explain." Andy took a deep breath, trying to control his rising anger. He wasn't the kind of man to lash out, but he needed answers. "Sandra," he said, his voice softer but firm, "I'm not here to drag this out or argue. I just need a closure. I need to understand what's going on. Why did you shut me out? Why are you making everything so difficult?" Sandra's tears began to fall freely. She couldn't hide her pain any longer. "Andy, I've made so many mistakes," she said, her voice trembling. "I was afraid you'd never forgive me if you knew everything. I didn't want to hurt you or face the truth myself. I thought it would be easier if I just disappeared." Andy's expression softened slightly. He could see the anguish on her face, the weight she was carrying. "Sandra," he said gently, "I'm not here to judge you. I just want to know the truth. Whatever it is, I need to hear it from you." Sandra looked up at him, her hands trembling as she wiped her tears. "Andy, I'm pregnant," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. Andy stared at her, his emotions swirling, shock, confusion, and something deeper he couldn't quite place. "You're pregnant?" he repeated, his voice low. Yes, Sandra said, nodding. It's yours. And I've been so scared. Scared of what you'd think. Scared of what your family would say. Scared of how everything would change. I didn't know how to face you, Andy. I didn't know how to face anyone. Andy ran a hand through his hair, stepping back slightly as he tried to process the news. For a moment, the room was silent except for the sound of Sandra's quiet sobs. Finally, Andy spoke, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Sandra, I don't care what my family thinks. This is about us, about our child. But I need to know, are you ready for this? Are you ready to take responsibility, to make things right? Because I can't do this alone. Sandra nodded, her tears flowing freely. I am, Andy. I know I've made mistakes, but I want to make things right. I want to be better for you, for our child, for my parents. I just need a chance. Andy looked at her for a long moment, his anger melting into something softer, compassion, understanding, and perhaps even hope. Then let's figure this out together, he said quietly. But no more running, Sandra. We face this together. Sandra nodded again, feeling a glimmer of hope amidst the storm of her emotions. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she wasn't alone. But deep down, she knew that facing the consequences of her past was only just beginning. Andy had been a pillar of support for Sandra since their emotional reconciliation. Despite his busy schedule, he spent most of his free time at her place, helping with cooking, cleaning, and making sure she didn't feel overwhelmed by her pregnancy. His quiet, consistent presence brought Sandra a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. That morning, they were preparing to leave for Sandra's first hospital appointment. Andy packed a small bag with essentials, while Sandra stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her loose dress and nervously smoothing her hair. Are you ready? Andy asked, his tone calm but encouraging. Sandra nodded, though her hands betrayed her nerves. I think so, she said softly. I'm just nervous. I don't know what to expect. Andy smiled, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. It's going to be fine. I'll be right there with you. Just as they were about to leave, Andy's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and frowned. It was a call from his boss. He hesitated for a moment before answering, stepping away from Sandra to take the call. Hello? Yes, sir, Andy said, his voice taking on a professional tone. As he listened, his expression grew more serious. Understood. I'll be there as soon as possible. He ended the call and turned back to Sandra, looking torn. That was work. They need me to handle something urgent. Sandra's heart sank, but she forced a small smile. It's okay, Andy. You have to go. Andy shook his head, conflicted. No, I promised I'd be there for you. And you have been, Sandra said gently. You've done so much already. I can handle this on my own. Andy hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of leaving her alone. Are you sure? Sandra nodded, her voice steady. I'll be fine. It's just a checkup. Andy sighed, still unsure, but finally relented. Okay, I'll drop you off at the hospital and come back as soon as I can. At the hospital, Andy helped Sandra out of the car, his protective instincts kicking in. Call me if you need anything, he said firmly. I mean it. Sandra smiled at him, touched by his concern. I will. Don't worry. Andy watched her walk into the hospital, his heart heavy as he got back into the car. He hated not being there for her, especially on a day as important as this, but he knew she was strong. Still, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that he should have stayed. As Sandra entered the waiting area, she took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. She glanced around at the other patients, feeling a mix of emotions, nervousness, excitement, and a lingering sadness from the journey that had brought her here. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like she wasn't completely alone. Andy's mother, Mary, had finally made her way into the bustling city, determined to confront Andy about Sandra. The energy of the city overwhelmed her, cars honking, people rushing by, and the constant buzz of activity. It was unlike anything she was used to, and it left her feeling disoriented. As she approached a busy street, Mary hesitated, unsure of when to cross. In a moment of confusion, she stepped forward just as a car came speeding around the corner. The driver hit the brakes, but it was too late. Mary was knocked to the ground, her body limp as onlookers gasped in horror. The driver quickly called for help, and an ambulance arrived within minutes, rushing Mary to the nearest hospital. The city's chaos seemed to fade as Mary was wheeled into the emergency room, her condition critical but stable. Sandra sat quietly in the waiting room of the same hospital, her hands resting on her growing belly. She had just finished her appointment and was waiting for Andy to pick her up when a commotion caught her attention. Nurses were moving quickly, and a woman on a stretcher was wheeled past her. Something about the woman struck Sandra as familiar. She stood, her heart racing. Is that Andy's mother? She thought. She hesitated for a moment, then cautiously approached the bed. As she got closer, her breath caught. The woman's face was bruised and swollen, making her nearly unrecognizable. Sandra leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. Could it be? Her thoughts raced, but she couldn't be sure. She pulled out her phone, her hands trembling, and called Andy. Her tone was urgent. Andy, is your mother in town? Or are you expecting her? Andy, caught off guard, replied, No, I haven't heard from her this week. Why? What's wrong? Sandra took a deep breath, her voice shaky. I'm at the hospital, and there's a woman here who looks like her. Andy, call your father. Ask if she's traveled. Andy's heart sank as he hung up and quickly dialed his father. Moments later, his worst fear was confirmed. His mother had left for the city earlier that day, determined to see him. Andy rushed to the hospital, his mind racing with worry. When he arrived, he found Sandra waiting for him outside the emergency room. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with concern. She's in there, Sandra said quietly, pointing toward the room. I wasn't sure, but now I'm certain it's her. Andy nodded, his throat tight, as he pushed open the door and saw his mother lying on the hospital bed. Her face was bruised, and she looked so fragile that it broke his heart. Tears filled his eyes as he walked to her side, kneeling beside her bed. Mama, he whispered, his voice cracking. Mama, it's me. You'll be fine. We'll take care of you. Mary's eyes fluttered open briefly, and she looked at Andy, a faint smile crossing her lips before she drifted back into unconsciousness. Andy wiped his tears, his resolve hardening. She'll be okay, he said, more to himself than to anyone else. She has to be. Her heart ached for him, and she silently vowed to do whatever she could to support him through this. Andy and Sandra alternated their care for Mary, dedicating every free moment to ensuring she wasn't alone during her recovery. Though Sandra struggled with her pregnancy, battling morning sickness and fatigue, she poured her heart into caring for Andy's mother. She prepared meals, adjusted Mary's pillows, and whispered comforting words, even when there was no response. For Sandra, it wasn't just about helping Andy, it was about doing what felt right. Weeks passed with Mary still in a coma. The doctors assured Andy and Sandra that she was stable, but the wait was agonizing. Every day, Sandra sat by Mary's bedside holding her hand, speaking softly about the things she hoped would reach her. "You'll be fine, Mama," she'd say, using the term with genuine care. "Andy and I are here, and we're not giving up on you." After some weeks, Mary was finally discharged home after making a full recovery. The house felt warmer with her return, and Andy was relieved to see her healthy and smiling again. However, he knew his mother had unresolved feelings about Sandra, and one evening his suspicions were confirmed when she called him for a private discussion. Seated in the living room, Mary gestured for Andy to sit across from her. Her tone was calm but serious. "Andy, I wanted to have a word with you," she began. Andy nodded, bracing himself. He had a feeling where this conversation was heading, but decided to face it. After all, he was old enough to make his own decisions. Mary started by thanking him, her voice soft with gratitude. "First of all, thank you for everything you did for me during my accident. You were there when I needed you most, and for that I bless you. May you always be favored in life." Andy smiled, touched by her words. "Thank you, Mama, but I couldn't have done it alone. Sandra was there every step of the way. She took care of you when you were unconscious, just like a daughter would care for her mother." Mary's expression darkened at the mention of Sandra. She leaned forward, her voice sharp. "Just like a mother? Does Sandra even know what it means to care for a mother? Andy, let me tell you something. There's something following that girl, something that isn't right. It's because of her that I nearly lost my life." Andy sighed deeply, knowing this wasn't going to be an easy conversation. "Mama, that's not fair. Sandra has done nothing but show care and dedication to you, even when she was going through so much herself. She's been nothing but supportive." Mary shook her head, dismissing his words. "Andy, you don't understand. There's a darkness surrounding that girl. Ever since she came into your life, everything has been falling apart." Mary's voice dropped lower, her tone firm and unyielding. "Andy, my mission here is very simple. Stay away from her. That girl is trouble, and I will not sit back and watch you ruin your life." Andy's heart sank. He knew this moment would come, but hearing the words from his mother still stung. He opened his mouth to respond, but Mary cut him off, her gaze narrowing as suspicion dawned on her face. "Wait," she said, her voice sharpening. "Don't tell me she's pregnant for you. Is she, Andy?" Andy hesitated, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He hated lying to his mother, but he also knew she wasn't ready to hear the truth. "Mama," he began cautiously, "Sandra and I are handling things the best way we can. Please trust me." Mary's eyes widened and her voice rose, sharp with disbelief. "So, it's true? She's pregnant? Andy, how could you let this happen? You're throwing your life away for a woman who abandoned her own parents. What kind of mother will she be if she couldn't even stay loyal to her family?" Andy took a deep breath, trying to stay calm despite the anger building inside him. "Mama, you're being unfair. Sandra has made mistakes, yes, but she's trying to make things right. You've seen how she cared for you while you were unconscious, even when she didn't have to. Doesn't that count for anything?" Mary shook her head, her expression unrelenting. "It doesn't erase her past. I raised you to make wise choices, Andy, to build a strong family. A girl who abandoned her own parents is not someone you build a strong family with." Andy's explanation did little to change his mother's mind. Mary remained firm in her stance, her suspicions about Sandra unwavering. She kept her thoughts to herself for a while, but her disapproval was clear in every interaction. One afternoon, Sandra came to visit Andy at his house. As she walked in, she was startled to see Mary seated in the living room. She hesitated, but Mary's piercing gaze made it clear There was no turning back. Andy wasn't home, and Sandra braced herself for what was coming. Mary wasted no time. Her tone was sharp as she spoke. Sandra, if you think that thing you call a pregnancy is going to soften my heart toward you, let me tell you now, you're lying to yourself. So far as I am alive, there will never be a marriage between you and my son. Sandra's heart sank and tears welled up in her eyes. Mama, please, she began, her voice trembling, but Mary cut her off with an even harsher blow. And how do I even know that this pregnancy is my son's? Mary said coldly, folding her arms across her chest. What proof do I have? A woman like you, with such a past. You? Mary's words were like daggers to Sandra's heart. She felt her knees weaken, but she steadied herself, refusing to let the weight of the accusation crush her. Tears streamed down her face as she spoke, her voice trembling with raw emotion. Mama, I've paid dearly for my bad decisions, Sandra said, her hands trembling as she wiped her tears. I know I've made mistakes. I know I hurt people, including my own parents, but I'm not the same person I was. Please, don't add more pain to my sorrow. I'm trying to fix things. I'm trying to be better, for myself, for Andy, and for this child. Mary's face remained stern, unmoved by Sandra's plea. Words are cheap, Sandra. Take action. That's the most important thing. You say you're a changed person, yet your parents are still waiting for you in the village. You think crying here will change my mind? Go and face the people you abandoned first, then come back and tell me you've changed. Sandra's tears flowed even harder, but her resolve grew stronger. That night, Sandra sat with Andy, her hands nervously clasped together as she spoke. Andy, I don't want to go to my parents in this state, she said softly, glancing down at her growing belly. I wanted to deliver first, to be in a better position to face them. But, from the way things are, I think I have to go now. Andy reached over and held her hand, his expression calm and supportive. Sandra, whatever you decide, I'll be with you. If you think it's time to go, then let's plan for it. We can go over the weekend. They discussed their plans late into the night, deciding on how to approach her parents and what they would say. The next morning, Sandra received an unexpected call from the hospital. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. Miss Sandra, you've missed 3 appointments. It's important you come in as soon as possible for a review, the nurse said. Sandra's heart sank. She had completely lost track of her appointments with everything going on, work stress, the tension with Andy's mother, and her plans to visit her parents. She quickly informed Andy about the call, and he encouraged her to go immediately. At the hospital, Sandra sat nervously in the examination room as the doctor reviewed her file and performed a thorough checkup. He frowned as he studied the ultrasound results, his expression growing more serious by the second. Miss Sandra, the doctor began, removing his glasses and looking her directly in the eye. You've been pregnant for over 12 months. This is highly unusual and concerning. You should have given birth by now. Sandra's heart dropped. 12 months? She whispered, her voice trembling. But how? I've lost track of everything, with work, the stress, and... The doctor interrupted gently, his tone calm but urgent. Sandra, this isn't something you can ignore. Your baby's well-being and your health are at serious risk. We need to act quickly. The only solution now is to perform a C-section to deliver the baby immediately. Sandra's mind spun as the words sank in. She felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Tears welled up in her eyes as she struggled to process the news. An operation? She repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. The doctor nodded. Yes, It's the safest option for both you and your baby. We need to schedule it within this week. If we delay any longer, there could be complications." Sandra's hands shook as she clutched her phone, her mind racing with fear and uncertainty. "Doctor, will my baby be okay? Will I be okay?" she asked, her voice breaking. Sandra nodded slowly, tears streaming down her cheeks. She fumbled with her phone and dialed Andy's number. The moment he answered, her emotions spilled out. "Andy," she sobbed. "The doctor says I need an operation. I've been pregnant for 12 months. I didn't even realize. I'm so scared." Andy's voice was steady and calm, though she could hear the worry behind it. "Sandra, listen to me. You're going to be okay. I'm on my way right now. Don't worry about anything. I'll be there with you." Sandra nodded, though she knew he couldn't see her. "Please hurry, Andy. I don't want to do this alone." As Sandra waited for Andy to arrive, she tried to steady her breathing, but the fear refused to leave. She thought of the baby she had been carrying, the life she had been nurturing amidst all the chaos of her own. She whispered a prayer, her hands resting on her belly. "Please, God," she said softly, "let this baby be okay. Let me get through this." Andy rushed into the hospital room, his face etched with concern. He found Sandra sobbing uncontrollably, her emotions spiraling out of control. She couldn't be consoled, her mind weighed down by all the pain and regrets of her past. "Andy," she cried, gripping his hand tightly, "I can't do this. I feel like everything in my life is collapsing. Every decision I've made, every wrong I've done, it's all haunting me. I don't even know if I deserve to have this baby. Please, take me to a church. I need to pray, to talk to someone who can help me make sense of this." Andy hesitated, knowing the urgency of her medical situation, but he could see how much this meant to her. He nodded. "Okay, Sandra, let's go." They arrived at a nearby church, where a kind elderly pastor greeted them warmly. Sandra, her voice trembling, poured out her heart, recounting every detail of her journey, the sacrifices her parents made, her abandonment of them, the failures in her relationships, and the overwhelming guilt that consumed her daily. She sobbed as she spoke, each word peeling back the layers of pain and regret she had carried for so long. Andy sat beside her, quietly absorbing everything. For the first time, he heard the full extent of Sandra's struggles. It was as if the pieces of her life were finally coming together, revealing the heavy burden she had been bearing alone. He reached for her hand, holding it tightly, silently assuring her that he wasn't going anywhere. The pastor nodded thoughtfully as Sandra finished, his calm presence comforting. He picked up his Bible and opened it to Ephesians 6:1-3, reading aloud in a steady voice. "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you, and that you may enjoy long life on the earth." He paused, looking at Sandra with kind but firm eyes. "Verse 3 is crucial, my daughter," he said gently. "It says, 'so that it may go well with you.' You see, because you didn't honor your parents, things in your life have not gone well, but there is hope. God's grace is bigger than our mistakes." The pastor continued, his voice calm and reassuring. "He knows you are ready to change, my daughter. The fact that you are here today, seeking guidance, shows that you want to make things right, and that is the first step toward healing. But you must take action to honor your parents. That is how you start rebuilding the foundation of your life. You just need to take the first step and trust that God will guide the rest. I have been scheduled for an operation which can't go beyond this week. I want to go and see my parents before that." The pastor assured Sandra they could go the next day. Sandra looked at Andy, her eyes pleading for his support. Andy gave her hand a gentle squeeze and nodded. I'm with you, Sandra. We'll do this together. The pastor closed the session with a heartfelt prayer, asking for God's guidance and grace as Sandra prepared to face her parents. The next morning, Sandra, Andy, and the pastor traveled to the village to reconcile with Sandra's parents. As they neared the house, Sandra's heart pounded with anxiety. The once vibrant home now looked worn and tired, a symbol of the sacrifices her parents had made for her. At the gate, Sandra hesitated. What if they don't want to see me? She whispered, her voice trembling. The pastor gently reassured her. Sandra, the first step is always the hardest, but it is also the most important. When the door opened, Mama Joy stood frozen, tears streaming down her face as she recognized her daughter. Sandra immediately fell to her knees, sobbing. Mama, it's me. I'm so sorry for everything. Please forgive me. Mama Joy embraced her tightly, crying, My daughter, is it really you? Papa Tunde, frail but strong in spirit, joined them, placing a trembling hand on Sandra's shoulder. You've come back. It's been a long time, my child. We forgive you. Now prove to us that you are truly ready to be our daughter again. Later that evening, Mama Joy opened up about the curse she had placed on Sandra in her anger and sorrow. Sandra, I cursed you when you abandoned us. I prayed that nothing in your life would go well until you remembered us. For that I am so sorry. No mother should speak such words over her child. Sandra wept, her heart heavy with the realization. Mama, I never meant to hurt you and Papa. I was blinded by ambition, but every step I took only led me further away from happiness. I'm so sorry. Mama Joy held Sandra's hands tightly. I take back every word I spoke in anger. From this moment on, I bless you. May your life be filled with joy and restoration. With her parents' forgiveness and blessings, Sandra found herself surrounded by love and hope. She silently vowed to honor her parents and give her child the life they had once dreamed of for her. Sandra lay on the hospital bed, trembling with fear, but determined to stay strong. The doctors moved quickly, assuring her that everything would be fine. Sandra closed her eyes, whispered a prayer, and took a deep breath. After what felt like hours, the cry of a baby filled the room. She had safely delivered a healthy baby girl. Tears streamed down Sandra's face as she held her child for the first time. The overwhelming joy of bringing life into the world washed away her fears and pains. Later that day, Mary arrived at the hospital, her face lit up with joy. She walked over to Sandra, who was resting with her newborn in her arms. Mary gently placed a hand on Sandra's shoulder. Sandra, Mary began softly, I never hated you. I only wanted you to understand the pain your parents endured because of your actions. I see now that you've learned and changed. I'm proud of you. Sandra's eyes filled with tears as she looked at Mary. Thank you, Mama. Your words mean so much to me. Mary smiled, leaning down to kiss Sandra's forehead. I bless you and Andy. You have my full support. Go ahead and build a happy home together. Andy, who had been standing quietly by the door, walked in and joined them. He embraced both Sandra and Mary, tears of gratitude in his eyes. For the first time in years, Sandra felt complete, a mother, a daughter, and a soon-to-be wife, surrounded by love and forgiveness. It was truly a happy beginning to a new chapter. No matter how far we stray, it is never too late to seek forgiveness and make things right. Honoring those who sacrificed for us opens the door to peace, love, and restoration.